Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This happens to be for our class for Wednesday, the 9th of February, where I wanted to put some closure onto the sonnets and then I wanted to move us forward to Shakespearean comedies. The first unit that we will be doing in terms of Shakespeare's genres. We think that Shakespeare wrote his comedies early on in his career, so that's usually the reason why most Shakespeare classes begin with the comedies. But as we've already established, there is uncertainty about many elements in relation to Shakespeare, including the dating of his particular plays. For the sonnets, your first journal will be due today, if you're watching this today on Wednesday, at 11:59 p.m. Some of you have already submitted in your journals. Thank you very much. And I just ask that you submit your journals to my email via PDF because that works best with my grading program. And then what I can do is evaluate it and then return it back to your email. Basically, I'm reading it for content, not for grammar or mechanics. Think of it as a kind of conversation on paper, where basically what I'm going to be doing is responding to you as if we were actually having a conversation. And there are many ways that you could proceed with this particular journal. I don't have a particular template. I'm suggesting about a page or so response. For the journals, you've got some options. You can decide to respond to all of the sonnets in this first journal, or you can decide to respond to several of the sonnets, or you can decide to focus on one in depth, and all of those are appropriate. When we get to the dramas, obviously you will be responding to a specific drama, but again, you've got lots of options on how you would go about responding to that particular drama. I graded informally on a checkmark system. Again, I'm more interested in the content than I am in the actual construction of it. Though eventually we'll have some formal papers and we can talk about how to construct a specific argument that's based on one idea or a thesis and that is developed over several pages. So, in terms of the comedies, Shakespearean comedies are devoted to love and all of the complications associated with love. I think of the modern day rom coms in some respects. And the Shakespearean comedies would also have a good amount of music and dance. They were very celebratory. This is something that you might miss when you are actually watching the drama or reading the dramas themselves rather than watching the dramas. It's one of the reasons why I wanted us to watch performance as well so that we could get that sense. There would be no death. So, in some ways, we have a rather formulaic approach to Shakespearean plays, in that there are elements that we can predict based on the genre. And not only would we not have death, but there would be a happy ending, which would mean a marriage or the promise of marriage. That said, even though the plays are somewhat formulaic, they also are very creative in terms of not only plot but also language, as we established with the sonnets, the multiplicities of meaning within the language. We can also expect within all of Shakespeare's plays a 5-act structure. And the first act helps to establish character. The second act is the beginning of the rising of tension. The third act is the height of conflict. The fourth act is the beginning of resolution. Fifth act is resolution. Midsummer Night's Dream is slightly different, though, because it would seem that the play comes to closure in Act 4, and that Act 5 is just sort of tacked on superfluously. But trust me, that's not the case. Everything in Shakespeare has a particular meaning and has a particular purpose. So that ultimately, that fifth act, which happens to be a play within a play, so we're going to see a performance within a performance, very meta, and Shakespeare's done this in some of his other plays as well. But that Act 5 is basically a commentary on the first 4 acts we would have seen. Now, when you're reading Midsummer, and in an ideal world, you would have finished reading Midsummer by this point, and you would be reading the next play, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. But I'm well aware we are not in an ideal world. We've got multiple classes devoted to Midsummer, and we'll begin by talking about production. So if you haven't necessarily finished the play, then ultimately, since we are going to be spending some time with production, this gives you some time to finish up before we actually talk about the specific content. But what you can expect in Midsummer even if you've just begun the play, is that it's going to be very confusing. This is deliberate because love is confusing, and that's the theme of this play, is about love. But Shakespeare does things like give characters similar names, Helena and Hermia, or he makes it very difficult to distinguish between characters like Lysander and Demetrius because they both seem to be interchangeable in some respects. Again, that's done very deliberately. And by the middle of the play, it will be so confusing that it will be difficult to keep track of the love relationships. Again, to illustrate the idea that love is fickle and love is very transitory. We will have multiple subplots, multiple stories, but all of those stories are going to be related to one another. Expect humor. This is, after all, a comedy. And as I had indicated earlier, music and dance and this sense of celebration. And the play within a play, of course, in Act 5. And, as is typical of Shakespeare, some social and political commentary, though it may not necessarily be obvious. So we might have to read between the lines, so to speak, in order to be able to find that. Now, what I had originally intended to do was to show you a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream that was done in Shakespeare's reconstructed Globe Theatre. And it's actually one of my favorite performances of A Midsummer Night's Dream. What I found today, unfortunately, is that that was removed from the internet. I suspect there was probably a copyright issue. And I've been trying to find another version of it. Thus far, what I've been able to find is something on YouTube that was recorded from someone in the audience. Perhaps the way that we would view this play would be much like an audience member without necessarily having the luxury of technical equipment that would allow close-ups and things of that nature. So in some sense, perhaps by watching this production, or at least by watching a portion of this production, we can mimic what we might have experienced in a theater. We wouldn't necessarily have had the best view. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to listen to Shakespeare's plays. In addition to watching the plays, because you oftentimes wouldn't be able to see. But nevertheless, I was able to find on YouTube some of the play that had been recorded by an audience member. So I'm going to have us watch the first 2 acts today. And you can see that at the bottom of the notes, I've indicated the links for that. Unfortunately, you're going to have to go through multiple links. The first link is 16 minutes for Act 1, Scene 1. The second link is 9 minutes for Act 1, Scene 2. Third link happens to be 17 minutes for Act 2, Scene 1. And then the last link that I'll have you watch today is Act 2, Scene 2, and that's 12 minutes. And then next class, we can continue on with watching other elements of this particular play. But some of the things I wanted you to keep in mind while you are watching this is to keep in mind character. And this perhaps is easier when you're watching a performance because you've got the physical appearances of the actors to connect with the characters so that you can differentiate the actors and the characters more easily from one another. That might be more difficult when you're reading. But basically, we are introduced to Theseus and Hippolyta at the beginning of the play. They are engaged, and basically Theseus has won Hippolyta in war. So she is basically a war conquest. This would have been a rather typical kind of love during the time period, a political union. Hermia and Lysander. This is a young dating couple, and they're dating against Hermia's or her father's will. This would have been an atypical kind of love because the daughter is defying her father, and her father would have been in a position of power during this time period. Helena and Demetrius, another young couple that we are introduced to, that prior to the play they had dated, but Demetrius is no longer interested in Helena. He's broken off the relationship with her, and worse, he has become interested in Hermia. Now, not only is Hermia already in another relationship with Lysander, but Hermia and Helena happen to be or were once best friends before these love struggles were introduced. So we can see a commentary on what happens to friendships during love. Demetrius and Hermia. Now, Demetrius wants Hermia, but Hermia does not want Demetrius. Remember, she wants Lysander, even though her father disapproves. Her father wants her to be with Demetrius. So, the element of unrequited love, of loving somebody but not having them love you back, whether it's Demetrius now loving Hermia, or the idea that Helena still loves Demetrius even though he no longer loves her. In many ways, this is kind of like a soap opera. We're also introduced to fairies, so there's an element of the supernatural in this play that we're going to have to suspend some disbelief. But we will see that the fairy realm, even though the fairies have magical powers and they would be considered to be superior, they still have many of the flaws and frailties of humanity. The fairies, Oberon and Titania, they are a married couple, and they are bickering. They're arguing over a child. So basically, we see power struggles within love. The child is called a changeling, which we will talk a little bit more about as we discuss the play. And then finally, we're introduced to a single character. His name is Bottom. He's not involved in a love relationship. What he's doing is that he's putting on a play with his friends, his cohorts. He's named Bottom because he's at the bottom of the social scale. He's a laborer, but he also is an idiot. And this will be important as the play progresses. Eventually, he will become involved in a love relationship through magical intervention, because throughout the entire play, love juice, a magical love juice, will be used to influence individuals who fall in and out of love with one another through the fairies. The setting is also something for you to consider. That the play begins in Athens, the city. This would not have been uncommon for Shakespeare to set his play in an exotic locale, but it may as well be England proper, because outside of the fact that it's set in Athens, it seems very British. The city is supposed to represent reason and order, and then eventually all the characters move into the woods or the forest. And that is supposed to represent the wilderness, that which is wild, untamed, that is not subject to the laws of man. And what you will watch is how Shakespeare is able to move all of the major characters from Athens, the city, into the forest, the woods. And the forest happens to be where the fairies reside. So, again, as I indicated, I wanted you to watch the first 2 acts and then to talk a little bit about performance for today's attendance question, which would be due Friday, February 11th at 8 a.m. That based on what you've watched thus far for the first 2 acts, which actor's performance did you prefer? Which actor's performance did you like the best with this production, which is the 2014 Shakespeare on Screen adaptation, and why? So we're not just talking about character at this point, we're talking about acting. And as I indicated, that what I was able to find is not necessarily of the highest quality on YouTube. But that said, it would probably be much more accurate as to what we would experience in a live audience, that we wouldn't have the benefits of high definition recordings. But I do apologize. So with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I hope you enjoy the first 2 acts of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. Bye-bye.